Good morning. I'm David Reese, Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this virtual meeting of the board. This is the first meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2021, and on or before September 30th, 2022. In preparation for this meeting, I reviewed my comments for our opening meeting in April of last year. We were all in a very bad way at the start of the pandemic. I thank those who put their lives on the line during this crisis to care for those in need and to ensure that we all continue to have access to food and the other necessities of life. I would be remiss not to say thank you again. Last year, our virtual hearings were cutting edge. The RGB was one of the first city agencies to go virtual, thanks to the hard work of Andrew, Brian, Danielle, and Charmaine. The research staff also quickly incorporated all of the information they could find about the economic effects of the pandemic on our city. Now, virtual hearings are ho-hum, but the staff has continued to incorporate new sources of data as soon as they become available in order to provide the board with as much information as possible to make good decisions. We are grateful to them for being so proactive about this important work. I do not think that we comprehended the extent of the suffering we would see in our plague year across the globe, throughout the country, down to our neighborhoods and into many of our homes. This suffering has been compounded by political insurrection and waves of injustice that swamp us, but we all take hope from the advances we have all made on the scientific front, the political front, and the home front. I believe that next year our work will be done face to face, not screen to screen. And this year, like last year, our little corner of the government must do its work in accordance with the law to ensure that we have a healthy housing stock for New Yorkers to live in as we move from crisis mode back to something resembling normalcy. With that, I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Christina DeRose.
Present.
Shayla Garcia.
Present.
Christiane Gonzalez Rivera.
Present.
Leah Goodridge.
Present.
Cecilia Hossa.
Present.
Alex Schwartz.
Present.
Scott Walsh.
Present.
David Reese present. Owner member Patty Stone has left the board and her position has yet to be filled. I would like to recognize her hard work and dedication to the RGB. On behalf of the current members, I would like to thank her for her service and we wish her well. City Hall is aware of the vacancy and we hope to have a new owner member in place for our next meeting. Our next virtual meeting will be April 22nd, starting at 9:30 a.m. Information on how to attend this meeting will be posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB, in our meeting section by Friday, and at the same time will be sent to those who are on our email list. If you are interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on RGB email updates under quick links. The preliminary vote for rent stabilized renewal lease adjustments is currently scheduled for May 5th. This will be a virtual meeting. Information to attend this meeting will be made available in the near future. Today, staff will present the 2021 Income and Expense Study and the 2021 Income and Affordability Study. Both of these reports will be posted on our website after the meeting. Just click research on our homepage to download these reports. Please note that the annual filings of the Conflicts of Interest Board Financial Disclosure Report 2021 filing period will be from May 10th through June 4th. We will send the packets to each board member in the next few weeks. I will now introduce Brian, who will be presenting the 2021 Income and Expense Study.
David, can I just?
Yes.
I just want to make sure people understand how they can get our email blasts. So I'm just going to go to our website, show them the quick link and show them how to sign up if they're interested in receiving emails about meetings, about releasing reports and whatnot. So I'm going to do that quick.
Taking full advantage of the Zoom format.
It's the third quick link, email updates.
Andrew, we can't hear you.
Andrew, you were muted. I'm not sure if you know.
I'm sorry about that. Let me go through that quickly again. Back to where I was. All right, so this is our homepage. Sorry about that. You get to our homepage by going to nyc.gov/RGB, nyc.gov/RGB, email updates right here. Brings you to this page. You're going to click on RGB newsletter, sign up. And here you would enter email, first and last name, which is optional, and then the zip code. If you're a robot, apparently you cannot sign up. But if you're not a robot, you click here and submit, and you should be good to go. But we encourage people to sign up because we want to share the information about meetings, our reports. So please sign up. Thanks. Okay, I'm done. So.
Brian, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks. Just gonna take a second to set up the screen sharing. Can people see that?
Yes.
Okay, all right, great. Good morning.
Good morning.
So this is the 2021 Income and Expense Study. It focuses on data from 2019 and prior years. It does not yet illustrate any of the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on the New York City economy, as the pandemic, as we know, did not begin until early 2020. Next year's edition of the Income and Expense Study is expected to demonstrate the pandemic's impact on the New York City housing market. First, I'll briefly review the methodology used in this study. Local Law 63, enacted in 1986, requires building owners to file RPIE forms with the Department of Finance annually, with some exceptions. These include condos and other kinds of buildings, residential buildings with fewer than 11 units, or buildings that have an assessed value of under $40,000. The Department of Finance matches 2020 RPIE filings with the New York State Homes and Community Renewal building file that contain at least one stabilized unit in order to get the sample used in this report. Then the data was screened for errors and those records were removed. The two data sets created were the main RPIE analysis of 14,777 buildings containing 668,359 units. This data is used to compute average revenue and cost for a moment in time view. And we also do a longitudinal analysis, which consists of 13,475 buildings with almost 618,000 units. This encompasses 2 years worth of RPIE filings. In 2019, rent stabilized property owners collected monthly rent averaging $1,450 per unit. And the median rent citywide in 2019 was $1,300. Like in prior years, units in pre-war buildings rented for less on average, $1,364 per month, than those in post-war buildings, $1,645 per month. At the borough level, the average monthly rent in stabilized buildings was $1,970 in Manhattan, with it broken down into core Manhattan at an average rent of $2,374 and $1,453 in upper Manhattan. In the other boroughs, it was $1,388 in Queens, $1,340 in Brooklyn, $1,121 on Staten Island, and $1,066 in the Bronx. The average monthly rent in the city, if you exclude core Manhattan, was $1,295. Many stabilized buildings supplement the rent by selling services to tenants, such as laundry facilities and parking, and earn commercial income from things such as cell towers and retail space. In 2019, rent stabilized building owners in New York City earned an average of $1,626 per unit. The citywide median was $1,410. Pre-war buildings earned $1,536 per unit, and those in post-war properties earned $1,830. Gross income was highest in Manhattan at $2,334, broken down into core Manhattan at $2,846 and upper Manhattan at $1,680. It's followed by Queens at $1,473, Brooklyn at $1,429, Staten Island at $1,204, and the Bronx at $1,192. Monthly income in the city, if you exclude Core Manhattan, was $1,397. This graph shows average monthly income and rent that were the highest in Core Manhattan at the top and lowest in Bronx. Core and Upper Manhattan are both shown at the top, and the city without Core Manhattan is shown at the very bottom. Average income is in blue, and average rent is in green. And like all the graphs in this slideshow, they're also in the report itself if you want to look at it more closely. Sale of services and commercial income account for 10.8% of the total income earned by rent stabilized building owners in 2019 citywide. That was down 0.2 of a point from the previous year. By borough, income earned from services and commercial rents was 15.6% in Manhattan, broken down into 16.6% in Core Manhattan and 13.5% in Upper Manhattan. It was 10.6% in the Bronx, 6.9% on Staten Island, 6.3% in Brooklyn, and 5.8% in Queens. In the city, excluding Core Manhattan, the proportion was 7.3%. The average monthly operating cost for units in stabilized buildings was $1,070 in 2019. The median monthly cost was $958. Costs were lower in units in pre-war structures, $1,030, and highest among post-war buildings at $1,159. By borough, the average costs were highest in Manhattan at $1,512. Within Manhattan, costs for units located in Core Manhattan averaged $1,791, while the costs in Upper Manhattan were $1,155. In the other boroughs, costs in Queens were $971, Brooklyn $921, Staten Island $830, and the Bronx at $826. If you exclude Core Manhattan, the average monthly operating cost for stabilized building owners in New York City was $934. This graph breaks down expenses by component and further splits them into pre- and post-war categories. The largest share of expenses went towards taxes, followed by maintenance and administrative costs. Post-war buildings, which are shown in green on the graph, spent more on taxes, administration, labor, and miscellaneous costs. Pre-war buildings, shown in blue, spent more on fuel, utilities, and insurance. And both types of buildings spent about the same on maintenance. The average expense per unit per month for all stabilized buildings is shown in brown. In 2019, distressed properties. 5.5% of buildings were found to have O&M costs greater than gross income, which are considered distressed. That represents an increase of 0.1 of a point from the prior year. Most distressed buildings are pre-war at 91%. By borough, 52% of the buildings are in Manhattan, while the remaining buildings are in the Bronx, 21%, Brooklyn, 16%, Queens, 10%, and Staten Island with 1%. Since 1990, when 13.9% of stabilized properties were considered distressed, the proportion of distressed buildings declined each year until 1999, when it reached 6.1%. From 1999 to 2004, the proportion generally increased, but then declined 10 times over the last 12 years, reaching 4.9% in 2016, which was the lowest level over this 30-year period. The proportion of distressed properties has since risen over the last 3 years to the most recent 5.5%. Revenue exceeding operating cost exceeds operating costs in nearly all stabilized buildings, yielding funds that can be used for mortgage payments, improvements, and/or pre-tax profits. The amount of income remaining after operating and maintenance expenses are paid is typically referred to as net operating income. NOI is considered a good indicator of a building's overall financial health. In 2019, rent-stabilized apartments averaged $556 of net income per month, while units in post-war buildings on average earn more, $671, and units in pre-war buildings earn less, $506 a month. The average NOI per unit in residential-only buildings was $499, 10.2% less than the average for all rent-stabilized buildings. In 2019, average NOI was significantly different by borough. The average monthly NOI is greater among stabilized properties in Manhattan, with an average of $822. There was a notable difference when looking at NOI within Manhattan. Core Manhattan properties earned on average $1,055 in NOI, twice as much as properties in Upper Manhattan, which earned an average NOI of $525 per unit per month. In the other boroughs, NOI was $508 in Brooklyn, $502 in Queens, $373 on Staten Island, and $366 per unit in the Bronx. The monthly NOI average calculated citywide, if you exclude Core Manhattan, was $463. In addition to NOI, another way we measure a building's financial health is to measure cost, income, and rent ratios, which, as the graph shows, closely mirror each other. Cost income ratios can be used as a tool to evaluate a building's financial health, assuming that buildings are better off by spending a lower percentage of revenue on expenses. In this graph, the audit adjusted cost income ratio was shown in green, the bottom line in the graph. In 2019, operating costs were 60.4% of gross income, a tenth of a percentage point lower than the prior year. Cost to rent ratio, the upper blue line, also declined, falling 0.2 of a percentage point this year to 67.8%. This slide breaks out rent, income, costs, and NOI figures between Core Manhattan, which is on the left, and the city with its core excluded, shown on the right. The graph shows that average rent, income, costs, and NOI are a great deal higher in Core Manhattan compared to the rest of the city. When looking at the cost income ratios, the difference between the two demonstrates that Core Manhattan owners spend on expenses when compared to owners of the rest of the city, about 3.6 cents less of every dollar earned. Now that's the difference between the two cost income ratios. This graph shows the inflation adjusted change in citywide income, rent, expenses, and NOI over a period of about 3 decades. Since 1990, income, the light blue line nearest to the top, cumulatively increased at inflation adjusted 43.5%. Rent, which is the second line from top in green, rose 43.2%. Costs, the third line in brown, grew 39.4%. And net operating income, represented by the lowest line in dark blue, increased by 52.1%. These graphs break down the same time period as the previous graph, but do it by borough. It shows that while the actual inflation adjusted income, rent, costs, and NOI figures are far higher in Manhattan, the percentage increase in NOI was not the highest in that borough. Brooklyn, at the top right, saw the largest NOI increase over this period, with NOI more than doubling, rising 118%. Queens at the bottom left had the second highest NOI increase, rising 71%. The Bronx at the bottom right experienced NOI growth of 69%, and Manhattan, shown at the top left, saw NOI growth of 44% since 1990. We will now move on to the second part of the income and expense study, which is the longitudinal analysis. The longitudinal sample encompasses properties that filed RPI forms reflecting conditions both 2018 and 2019. By conducting the longitudinal analysis, we can more accurately track changes from year to year as the same buildings are being analyzed. Average rent collections in stabilized buildings grew by 3.3% in 2019. Rent collections in pre-war buildings grew at a lesser rate, up 3.1%. And post-war buildings, which rose by 3.7%. Rent collections increased the most among large 100+ unit buildings, rising 3.5%, while mid-sized 20 to 99 unit buildings rose 3.3%, and smaller 11 to 19 unit buildings grew by 3%. Average rent grew in every borough. Staten Island saw the largest increase, up 3.9%, followed by Manhattan, up 3.8%. Within Manhattan, Core Manhattan rents grew at a faster rate, up 4%, compared to the 3.5% increase in rents in Upper Manhattan. In the other boroughs, Brooklyn was up 3.6%, Queens was up 2.9%, and the Bronx was up 2.2%. Rent collections in the city, excluding Core Manhattan, rose 3%, and the median rent grew citywide also by 3%. Examining rent collections throughout New York City, every community district saw increases in average rent from 2018 to 2019. At the local level, the greatest rent growth was found in two Brooklyn neighborhoods, Bushwick, which increased 18.8%, and Bed-Stuy, where rent grew by 6.8%. The next highest rent growth was in Manhattan's Lower East Side and Chinatown, rising by 5.5%, followed by Middle Village, Ridgewood, Queens, up 5.4%. Bronx neighborhood seeing the largest increase in rent was in Hunts Point, Longwood, up 4.5%. A list of all community districts and how much rent changed in each of them can be found in the appendix number 13. The average total income collected in rent stabilized buildings comprising apartment rents, commercial rents, and the sale of services rose 3.2% from 2018 to 2019. Revenue grew faster in post-war buildings, up 3.5%, compared to 3% among pre-war buildings. Income grew the most in Brooklyn, up 3.7%, followed by Manhattan, up 3.4%. Within Manhattan, core Manhattan income rose 3.4%, while upper Manhattan income grew by 3.3%. In Staten Island, income was up 3.1%, and in both the Bronx and Queens, they each rose 2.7%. Total income in the city, if you exclude core Manhattan, was 3.1%. The median growth in income citywide was also 3.1%. Average expenses in stabilized buildings increased 3.3% from 2018 to 2019. Pre-war buildings rose at a greater amount, up 3.5%, while post-war buildings costs rose by 3.1%. However, the change in operating costs varied by borough. Costs grew the most on Staten Island, up 5.2%, followed by the Bronx, up 3.9%, Brooklyn, up 3.5%, Queens, up 3.1%, and Manhattan, up 3%. Within Manhattan, core Manhattan costs rose by 3.1%, and upper Manhattan costs grew by 2.7%. Operating costs in the city, if you exclude core Manhattan, rose by 3.4%, and median costs rose 3.6% citywide. It can be useful to compare the cost changes calculated from RPIE filings with the price and cost data from the price index of operating costs, which was adjusted to match time periods between the two. The adjusted PIOC is shown in blue and the RPIE data is in brown. The graph shows that income and expense data grew at different rates in some years since 1990. In the most recent year, the PIOC grew by 4.2% from 2018 to 2019, the same period as the 3.3% increase in RPIE expenses, which was a 0.9 percentage point difference. Net operating income, NOI, refers to the earnings that remain after operating and maintenance expenses are paid, but before payments of taxes and debt service. Income tax and debt service. Citywide NOI in rent stabilized buildings increased by 2.9% citywide between 2018 and 2019. This was the 14th increase in NOI in the last 15 years. Citywide NOI in post-war buildings grew 4.3%, while older pre-war buildings rose by 2.2%. The change in NOI from 2018 to 2019 varied throughout the city. NOI increased in 3 boroughs, but declined in 2. The largest increase was in Brooklyn, where it rose 4.2%, followed by Manhattan, up 4.1%. Within Manhattan, NOI rose in upper Manhattan 4.6%, and in core Manhattan up 3.9%. NOI in Queens also rose, up 1.9%. Meanwhile, NOI declined 0.1% in the Bronx and 1.1% on Staten Island. And the monthly NOI in the city, excluding core Manhattan, grew by 2.5%. Now we'll look at the community district level NOI changes. NOI rose in almost 3/4 of the city's neighborhoods. The greatest NOI growth occurred in Brooklyn, Brooklyn's Bushwick neighborhood, up 45.9%, followed by Sheepshead Bay, Gravesend, up 11.9%. Manhattan's Morningside Heights, Hamilton Heights saw the next largest increase, up 9.8%, followed by Brooklyn's East New York, Starrett City, up 9.6%, and Bed-Stuy, up 8.8%. The next highest growth was in Forest Hills, Regal Park, Queens, up 8.6%. The greatest increase in the Bronx was in Mott Haven, Port Morris, up 6.3%. Meanwhile, a quarter of the city's neighborhoods experienced a decline in NOI. The largest decrease occurred in 3 Queens neighborhoods: Jamaica, falling 4.7%, Hillcrest Fresh Meadows, down 5%, and Flushing Whitestone, down 4.4%. Next was University Heights Fordham in the Bronx, down 3.5%. Hunts Point Longwood, down 3.3%. The North Shore of Staten Island, down 2.4%. Coney Island in Brooklyn, down 2%. And Midtown Manhattan, down 1.9%. And like with the change in rents, the change in NOI can also be found for each community district in Appendix 13. This table lists the average annual change in rent, income, expenses, and net operating income from 1990 to the present. To summarize the findings of the Income and Expense Study from 2018 to 2019, citywide average rent grew by 3.3%. Revenue collections increased by 3.2%. Expenses rose by 3.3%, and NOI citywide increased by 2.9%. It was the 14th time in the last 15 years that NOI rose, as well as the 25th increase in the last 29 years. We also did a memo that the board members received. Before I finish up, I'd like to highlight a few tables in the memo. This is table 1 in the memo that breaks down proportion of buildings in certain categories. Anyway, 3 years ago, the RGB staff was asked to research whether the income and expense profiles of stabilized buildings varies depending on the proportion of stabilized units. We updated the memo this year, and I'll briefly highlight a few tables from it. This table illustrates the proportion of buildings that are stabilized in each category, broken down by location. It shows that in the city, excluding Core Manhattan, which is the bottom row in yellow highlight, it shows that 82% of buildings contain at least 80% stabilized units. Meanwhile, in Core Manhattan, which I highlighted in blue, stabilized buildings contain a much smaller proportion of non-stabilized units. Just 28% of buildings contain at least 80% stabilized units. Looking at the proportion of buildings containing at least 80% stabilized in the other boroughs, and Upper Manhattan, it was 71%, 75% in Queens, 80% on Staten Island, 84% in Brooklyn, and 93% in the Bronx. I'll also break down another table, table 4. It breaks down the audited and unaudited cost income ratios by citywide, Core Manhattan, and the city excluding Core Manhattan. And when looking at the unaudited cost income ratios for all buildings containing stabilized units, there is a 4.3 percentage point difference between Core Manhattan, which is 63.4, and the rest of the city, 67.7%. However, among buildings that have at least 80% stabilized units, the difference shrinks to 3.3 percentage points, 64.8% in Core Manhattan and 68.1% in the rest of the city. This suggests that the building income and expense ratios may be more dependent on the proportion of stabilized units in a building rather than whether a building is in Core Manhattan or elsewhere in the city. In the final table I'll discuss, this is table 5 in the memo. It breaks down the longitudinal change in rent, income, costs, and NOI growth from 2018 to 2019 citywide in Core Manhattan and the rest of the city. It shows that the increase in both the rent income was smaller throughout the city when going from 20% stabilized or to 80% plus stabilized. Cost growth, the city excluding Core Manhattan saw similar growth among all categories of buildings, which is the ranges 3.1% to 3.2%, while in Core Manhattan, it was a much wider range with a higher proportion of stabilized units seeing a lower increase in costs. It's 3.4% for all stabilized buildings to 2.2% increase in costs among buildings with at least 80% stabilized units. As for NOI growth, it was strongest among 50% or more stabilized properties in Core Manhattan, 1.7%, and among 20% or more stabilized properties in the remainder of the city, 2.5%. Thank you. That concludes my report. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So let's just open it up to questions. People should feel free to just jump in.
So,
Hi,
Brian, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, no, Leah, you go first. Yep.
Thank you. Good morning. Hi, Brian. Thank you so
Morning.
much for your work. I have a quick clarification question. I think if I'm seeing this correctly, for last year's study, the city market rate, sorry, I just had it on the report. For 2020, it looks like the city market rate rent was, sorry, I think it was 12. I just want to verify if it went up by $150. Okay, so just so I'm clear here. Okay.
Leah, what are you looking at, just so we could all look at it?
I am looking at the same study from last year and comparing it to this year for the city overall rent. I know we said 3.3%, but I guess when I looked at the actual numbers, it was like over $200, I think. So that's why I wanted to clarify, because I think it's important to see it through the actual dollars. You know, I'll find it and then I'll go after Christian. How about that?
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. And so a quick question. I found it curious that sort of the share of stabilized units, basically, I mean, it's like the share of buildings in core Manhattan that have 80 plus units is lowest in Manhattan and in core Manhattan. Yet that's also where most of the distressed properties are. So I found that curious. I mean, it's can you talk a little bit about sort of the drivers of distress in this case? Because it's just not what I would expect.
Can I tag on to that? Can you define how you guys, like, what is the definition of distress in this report specifically?
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Basically, distressed properties are those properties that have costs greater than gross income. So it's a why they're in core Manhattan. I mean, that's been the case for years. We don't get any specific information about these buildings other than what we report. We don't actually look at the buildings. We get the data in aggregate. So to examine specifics, I couldn't really do, unfortunately. I wish I could. But the distress, the proportion of distressed properties in Manhattan and core Manhattan has always been the majority. But you're talking relatively small number, and they're mostly pre-war, 91% pre-war, and those are older buildings with higher operating costs and lower income probably.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting that I would have expected, since stabilized properties on average have lower rent, of course, than market, that wouldn't be the case. So it's just kind of surprising that the relationship went the other way. So that's what I was mostly just curious about.
Yeah, and let me see. There's a little more breakdown in the report. Let me see if that let me see what it's appendix 7. The breakdown in Manhattan, core Manhattan, it shows that they're mostly there are a large number of small buildings. It's only, of all the distressed properties in core Manhattan, all but 11 are smaller or have fewer than 100 units. I don't have percentages broken down here, but
Do you happen to know, I mean, it's like among 100% market units. Is there also sort of a difference there between sort of larger buildings and smaller buildings in terms of distress? I mean, is it a small building issue then?
I can't say, I don't have any information about buildings that are market rent that don't have any stabilized units. This is only buildings with at least one stabilized unit in it. I couldn't compare it to, I don't know what the breakdown is of these buildings are. I don't know what proportion of stabilized versus non-stabilized units are. This is about as specific the information we get,
Okay.
I'm afraid.
Christian, I suspect someone is in part to real estate taxes, which are generally significantly higher in Manhattan based on the assessed value of the property. So if you have a smaller building in Manhattan, it's a higher assessed value, their taxes are higher. And that's over 30% of their expense is taxed. So I suspect that has something to do with it. Also, I think that with the free market, even though we know that in core Manhattan that the buildings have more free market units in them, but they are subject to the market. So sometimes you find that if rents are going down in the market itself, that has more of an impact on the building than the lower stabilized rents, perhaps. So they can see loss of income on the market side. So that can sometimes impact things depending on how well the real estate market did in that particular year. I suspect next year, for example, we'll see more loss of income and rent in those buildings that have market rents because they're probably impacted more by the pandemic. So just because they're free market units are in them, it doesn't necessarily say it's going to be a healthier building. It depends on what the real estate market's doing. So that could be part of it. I suspect though the biggest expense, which is real estate taxes in Manhattan, they're assessed higher. And you may find that that's part of the reason that those tend to have more distressed units.
Okay.
Buildings with distressed unit, that are distressed.
Not that there's probably more volatility in the market units. I mean, this is something I don't know. I mean, it's like, I know that property taxes is sort of a Byzantine property tax assessment system, but are property taxes a higher proportion of expenses in smaller buildings than in larger buildings?
We'd have to take a look at that. That's a good question. It could be. I don't want to answer without taking a look at it. But Brian, I think we could take a look at that, right?
The proportion of taxes, we might be able to get more. Yeah, we don't look at other than what we report, we could look at a lot more in terms of what the proportion is. Yeah, we can do that.
Thanks.
Should we return to Leah before we go to Alex and then Shayla?
I actually answered my own question, so thank you.
Okay. All right. Let's turn to Alex and then Shayla.
Well, yeah, I love you. Thank you.
Well, Brian answered my question in his research, so.
Hi, thank you so much. I have a few questions, mostly just informational, one of which I think I might have asked last year. Could you say briefly why there are so many units that are not covered by the RPIE study? I think it's 600,000 units, and there's something under 1 million rent stabilized units overall. Is it because of the building size cutoff?
Well, the million units is that is what the HVS has always found. This is maybe 100,000 and change that DHCR finds, I think, right? No, 800,000. I forgot what the latest numbers are.
But several hundred, 200,000-300,000 units.
Yeah, I mean, it's also based on whoever's filing, and there's also some that are removed that are problematic. We've removed when I think we removed the top and bottom 1% to remove extremes. So some of that is because of is that removal, and also because of the buildings with fewer than 11 units. But basically, almost everyone every building should be filing that has at least 11 units, or if even less than 11 if they have commercial space. But
Brian, do we know the percentage of the rent stabilized housing stock that is in buildings containing 10 units or fewer?
I don't know that offhand. I don't know if we get that. I can look into that.
We've gotten that in the past, and I could try to find the last memo that we did on that. But I want to say it's roughly 10% of the units are in buildings that are with fewer than 11 units. But let me see if I can find that memo while you guys continue.
Alex, can I turn to Shayla?
I have a couple of other questions, but you can go to Shayla and then come back afterwards.
You can finish, Alex, if you want.
Okay, thanks. So another short intro. I have like three questions more. One is the because a lot of buildings don't have any commercial or non-rent income. I think it would be interesting to know, like for those buildings that do have non-rent income, what percent that is. Right now, I think we're showing overall for all units what the average percent of commercial income, other kinds of non-rent income. But it'd be interesting, I think, to see for those that do have this income, how much it is a percentage of their overall income, as opposed to looking at all buildings, because many of them don't have any. So that would be an interesting question to look at.
That would be a special request. We don't currently get that information for buildings that we look at residential only. We look at all buildings. We don't look at buildings that have commercial space.
I see.
But by looking at buildings only residential, that gives us some sense of what's happening with buildings that have commercial. I mean, I guess you'd have to kind of imply a little bit the difference between the average for all buildings and what's the average for residential only.
I mean, I think Alex's point might be that if you have more income in commercial, like what percentage of their actual income is actually commercial income in a building that is mostly rent stabilized. I think it's data that would give us some insight on, does it make it more viable or less viable depending on whether people have commercial space in their buildings.
That's right. So I just think that it'd be useful to know to what degree for overall, for the entire, for buildings that do have commercial space, what impact it has. Anyway, so that's one question. The other is
I'm sorry, Alex, just to follow up with Brian on that. If we know all the buildings that are residential only, doesn't that mean that we also know all the buildings that have commercial? Because they're all the other buildings.
Are all required to report their commercial space?
It's required that they report all their income and expenses. That would include anything, any revenue they earn.
To go back and answer David's question, yes, we could get the data for buildings that have commercial income. There's a unit in the building that's commercial, generating commercial income. And it is most likely the difference between the residential and the commercial file, but we can't analyze just that, say there's a difference of 100, whatever, how many buildings, 500 buildings or whatever it is, but we'd have to specifically ask for those 500 buildings. We can't just take the data we have now and subtract one from the other. We'd have to make a special request for that. But can we ask it? Yes, we can ask for that.
I mean, commercial income includes things just even as simple as laundry facilities. So, I mean, obviously not every building has a laundry room, but if you're going to get some buildings. Obviously, the buildings with commercial space will include some with retail establishments and some and parking and parking garage for the public, and some may just include a laundry room. So it may not. I'm not sure how you can break down further in terms of comparing those. We get too nitty gritty.
Sorry, Alex, if you want to continue.
Yeah, so another question is, in previous years, did we see the same kind of divergence in terms of neighborhood difference, even borough difference in terms of NOI and costs. So it's striking that in the Bronx, NOI went down, whereas it went up in the other boroughs, went down in Staten Island. And also 25%, if I remember correctly, the community districts have a decline in NOI and 75% increase. Is that similar to what we saw last year and previous years?
Well, I mean, for many years, as I said in the report, most years NOI increased. So in years where it was a bigger increase, like when we had 10.8% about 5 years ago, you're not going to find any decreases anywhere. And when you found a decrease last year, it was only 0.6%. And 2 years ago, the increase was 0.4%. So it depends a lot on how, if it's a very small increase or decrease, you're going to find differences in the boroughs. So, this is not surprising to find variability in community districts. Certain community districts like Bushwick, of course, have been hot, very hot districts and neighborhoods. So you're going to see large increases in rent and NOI because of that. And, each of the reports each year we have broken down rent and NOI change. So the variability is not surprising.
Okay, good. And then my last question, which I think is actually the more interesting one, is it possible to look at operating costs in terms of rental categories? It'd be interesting to know, like for lower rent units, buildings with lower average rents, are operating costs commensurately lower versus in higher rent buildings? That basically implies something about sort of the base of what the minimum income would be to afford the rent. And I think it'd be interesting to know how much operating costs correlate with rental income.
Well, you can see that actually if you look at each of the borough graphs on page 12 in the report. Like I mentioned, the costs are a good deal lower in the Bronx, especially, but even the other boroughs compared to Manhattan. So you have lower rents, lower income, lower costs in the Bronx, and of course in Manhattan you have much higher incomes in rent and higher costs. So there is we do find that there is generally a correlation.
By borough, so that's sort of a proxy. Lower income boroughs have lower average costs. Anyway, I think it might be interesting if it's possible to see, more systematically for different rent categories what the corresponding operating costs are. Anyway, those are my questions. Thank you.
Sure.
Andrew, is that possible to do that? You're muted, Andrew.
We'd have to ask finance whether we could do that or not. We'd have to establish some sort of determine rental categories. I don't know if we would do it by, maybe we would do it by quintiles or something. I don't know. We'd have to figure out, we'd have to give them some sort of map on how to do that. So we'd have to have a discussion about that. I mean, we can ask finance and see if they can do that.
Yeah, it may, I don't know how specific, in terms of numbers, especially when you get down into the boroughs, I'm not sure how many the groupings might get too small for them to report on.
Would another
well, I don't know if we could take into effect building size necessarily in that situation or by borough. We couldn't do it by community district certainly, but maybe we could. We'd have to look into that. So.
Oh, also, while you were talking, I mentioned that I looked up the number of buildings that have residential only. It's about 9,800 buildings that are residential only, and we have about 14,800 buildings that are in total. So that means you would have about 5,000 buildings that have commercial space. If we got data, just FYI.
Commercial income, not commercial space.
Commercial, that have commercial income, right? Yes.
Shayla, I'm sorry, just to finish up with Alex's questions, I'm sorry to keep putting you on hold, but Alex, what hypothesis do you have about what that might tell us if we looked at costs on a rent basis?
I think it would be able to get a sense of what sort of the floor is in terms of affordability. That if if there's a certain minimum cost, that implies something about what it takes to afford the rent in those buildings.
So along those same lines, I mean, do you think that we might be able to get at it? That's a really interesting question, Alex. I mean, do you think we might be able to get at that if we break it down by costs per share of stabilized units in a building? Because right now, I mean, it's like we have that cumulatively, right? We have 20% plus, we have 40% plus, 80% plus, et cetera. But if instead of having it be cumulative, we actually disaggregated it. And do you think, I mean, it's like we might be able to just sort of like cross-tab the data in a different way, the existing data in a different way, and get at that?
Yeah, that would also be a request because we don't get the original data. We would have to request that from Department of Finance and see if
they tabulate it for you in this way. They tabulate it in this cumulative way.
Yeah, because they refuse to give any of the data that we can't tabulate anything ourselves.
Okay.
But it's a request that we can make. I think they can do it. The question is,
But would that help, Alex, you think? I mean, you think by doing it by share of stabilized units that are inside each one of those buildings?
I think I think it's slightly different because there's a range in terms of what the rents are in stabilized buildings.
Sure, but also then divided by borough, just like it is now. So basically,
I guess that would help.
Proxy.
And I guess it's a question of what's easiest, or what Department of Finance would agree to do.
Okay.
Before you jump on, just to answer that question, so we did a memo in 2017 about the number of units that are in buildings with 10 or fewer units. It was 9.7% of the total units, and about 113,000 units total that are in smaller buildings that are not representative in the I&E. Those numbers could change, could be different now because the total they have here is over 1.1 million. So, but that's data from finance. So we'd have to, I can circulate this memo from 2017. I'll send this around to everybody, but it does have a breakdown.
But there's still a gap of 100,000 or 200,000 units between the two measurements of the number of rent stabilized units.
Yeah, I mean, this is the same year the HVS came out, ironically.
Yeah. So
they had 966,000 units. I don't know exactly how finance determines finance has to establish or it has to know the stabilized units because they're the ones who actually collect the fee from owners for a DHCR. So there's a $10 fee for each stabilized unit, and that's paid to the Department of Finance, actually. It's part of the tax bill. And then presumably it gets to DHCR somehow after that. So they do have to know if a unit is stabilized or not in order to charge that fee.
Andrew, is it worth asking finance if they understand why there's a gap between them and HVS, or that won't get us anywhere?
I can ask.
Okay.
Is it worth asking?
I don't know if I'm asking out of turn, but I remember, Andrew, when I first got on the board, that the finance team came, and I think there was some kind of version of this question. And what they said, there was like the outliers on either end of the reporting might be, I don't know if that's like how we're getting smaller numbers maybe. But they were explaining something about like the ranges and,
we do exclude the very top and bottom extremes. Anything that's 1% at the top or the bottom, and also income, if rent is higher than a range, higher than, depending on the borough, let's say several $1,000s. So there are some that we exclude from our analysis.
But that's only like 20,000 units, right? So that's not, yeah, that doesn't get us all the way there. It's a piece, but it's only 1% on the top and 1% on the bottom is about 20,000 units of housing. All right, Shayla, the floor is yours.
So I basically wanted to ask a few questions because I just remember when we were having discussions on the 2 years that we had rent freezes, and I just want to get Brian's perspective on, are we seeing the impact of 2 consecutive years with rent freezes in order 47 and 48? Are we seeing what that impact would have been to NOI in this report right now?
Well, I mean, it takes into account this most recent report. It takes into account the change from 2018 to 2019. So the guidelines in effect up to and prior to that date would be reflected in that, I would say. And it also takes into account part of the period of the new rent law in the second half of 2019. So, certainly, well, like I said, next year we'll see the impact of COVID-19 in the report. So everything, the guidelines certainly play a part in what income it is.
I think my question maybe, and you've been looking at these reports for years, so maybe have you seen impact that like shows us that maybe buildings aren't doing well right now, or that it is less viable to have a rent stabilized building in this current year, given that we've had a few years with, I mean, thinking about the orders, we had order 47 was 1% for 1 year leases, 2.75 for 2 years, 47 was 0. 48 was 0, and then we saw historic lows for 3 years after that. So I'm basically asking if you have any thoughts on like what does it look like as far as viability in the rent for landlords on their income and NOI in general. I know it's gone up 24 times over the last 29 years.
Right. If you look at the table on page 17, that summarizes it going back to the 1990. So I think that is the most useful page in the report for people to use. I think based on the NOI boils it down the most. So, I don't want to get into the politics of it as a staff member personally. So I'll let the board members draw any conclusions they like.
And I think when everyone was talking through rents, NOI by borough, core Manhattan out, like I started to think, I know that we have this chart in some version towards the end of the our deliberations, it feels like it comes where we have like actual rents pay, what were the legal rents, I don't know what categories we can have those things in, and then what is the NOI for buildings, so that we can see, is there, I mean, for me, it's like good to see them together, because putting all these connections, making these connections across reports, I find it hard, and I'm a visual learner. So I'm just interested to see, like, I think to Christian's earlier point and questions from Alex, if we could see what are buildings at, like, what are they actually collecting on average, and do that by borough, and then see that with like what does NOI look like for those years, so that we can. For me, it's just interesting because I think the point that Christian made earlier, and I know that the staff won't get into this, but just looking at the areas where you saw a high increase of NOI and then a high increase of distressed buildings, those are all areas that were had been through rezonings, or there's major development happening in those areas. And for me, that's a interesting thing to see in these reports, because it actually shows the impact, not just of our decisions, but what's happening in the city as a whole. And to me, it's very important in making this decision, because in boroughs where you would traditionally see, you would assume like, right, the Bronx people are poorer, you would see a greater, the cost of living is smaller, but people are higher rent burden, for example, versus like now we're seeing the Hudson Point area, there was a huge, there's a lot of development happening there, but they're also seeing higher NOI, but also more distressed units. And so I think that those are just interesting things to see if we can have charts or something where it like maps out or compare some of these stats across reports. Because I don't think you could just look at NOI by itself without looking at the affordability and what people actually pay in rent. Because I'm assuming that the NOI is increasing, even though we had zero rent guidelines, maybe because of commercial pieces of the profile, but maybe also because there is just, they can't actually ask, they can't collect that rent because the market doesn't bear it. And so our deliberation today is not just on, can we, what is the average rent, but also what can people actually afford, and are we making a difference because they can't collect the rents that we're even making decisions on.
Shayla, can I just jump in on what you're saying? Andrew, where do we have the, I mean, this is speaking to part of what Shayla's asking, where do we have the historic NOI as a percentage of income chart that shows kind of when landlords are doing relatively well or when landlords are doing relatively poorly, and that there's certain kind of warning signs when the ratio gets too small? Where is that? That's not in the income and expense study, is it? You're muted, Andrew.
Yeah, I know. It is in the income and expense study. It's on page 10. I can bring it up if you like.
And Andrew, maybe you could comment on like your interpretation of that chart.
Oh, wait, is Andrew speaking? I think he's muted.
Oh, you're muted, Andrew. Andrew, you're muted.
I'm sorry about that. Let me go back in. I'm sorry. Getting there.
And then Shayla, your other point was, so I feel like there's two prongs to your point, Shayla, but I'm forgetting what the other prong was. That if we look.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So this is the cost to income and the cost to rent ratios. This includes, they're audited here. So O&M to cost rent income here. So in 2015, and O&M is the operating and maintenance to the income that the owner is bringing into the building. So you can graph this. So in 2004, there was probably the historically high point of this. It was around 65% in 2005. And up here it was, 73. So basically it's 65 cents on the dollar is going to operating and maintenance. And then, when you compare it to income, and if you compare it to rent, which would be buildings without commercial income, it's at 75. So those were audited. So if you go through, now we're currently at about 67 cents, I guess. But just looking at the chart for O&M to rent and the O&M to income, I think it was at 60.5 cents. So those are worth watching over time, and this is audited. If you go to the unaudited numbers, these two will be higher. And we know that there's, the audit goes way back to 92. With our discussions to finance, to try to redo that audit would not be possible. But finance does recognize that there is an over-reporting of expense. So when they do their tentative assessments or assessments of buildings, they take that into account. So somewhere in between the two is probably the right number. But for a healthy situation for buildings, once you start getting to 62 or 63, 64, somewhere in there, it is a warning sign of the health of a building. Currently, right now, those numbers suggest that they've risen in recent years, but they've flattened out the last 2 years. We may see a rise or a decline depending on what's going on with the pandemic and things like that. So this is an early warning sign that the board may want to consider as that creeps up. You may want to look at that as the health of the stock you may need to inject some revenue into the buildings if they remain flat. So it's hard to say what the exact number is, but getting up to 63, 64%, then that's a telling sign on the health of the stock. So that's the O&M to rent and O&M to income. Just another interesting chart. We were talking, Shayla was touching on the impact of our guidelines. So if you look on page, I believe it's on page 7 of the report, we do monitor the growth in RPI rent growth, the growth that we find that registered rents with HCR and what we determine our RGB index would result in. It's the growth of rents just due to our guidelines. So in years of the rent freeze, you can see the impact on the RGB rent index. These numbers are reflected, because 2-year leases had increases, plus there would be vacancy leases having higher increases. So that's all sort of factored into that RGB rent index. But these are the years with the rent freeze. And it didn't impact, it started to impact HCR rents. If you go 5.4%, 5.1, then our rent freezes kicked in. But notably this year, it's at 2.6 rent growth for HCR. And that is probably a sign that our guideline is impacting the growth of what's happening with HCR, because it was almost equal to our RGB rent index. Going forward, I suspect that would continue because of the changes in the law from 2019. Those should start to become on par. The only way that it would really differ if preferentials going to legal on vacancy. There are also MCI and IAI increases that can happen, but I would suspect going forward, these two numbers would be similar. These are reflective of the, what we see in the RPIE rent growth. These are free market units are in here. You're also getting, other increases that owners could take over the years. So that's why this percent growth would be you suspect would be a bit higher, but it's not always the case with HCR rent but that's affected by the market.
Andrew, does RPIE would also include increases in market rate units, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
But the other two would not.
Right. It also takes in vacancy and collection losses. That's their growth in rent. So there's other market forces going on there that wouldn't be necessarily reflected in the HCR and RGB index. But it'll be interesting to go forward to see whether or not those guidelines, our RGB rent index and the rent growth that's actually in HCR should be similar going forward with the changes in the rent law. So gets a little bit to the question that Shayla asked.
Shayla, there's also like a geographic aspect to your question. Like it would be interesting to look at certain communities. Could you explain more, like what you're thinking about there?
Sure. So a few of the slides that Ryan, and I guess when I read the report, I didn't pick up on this the same way until I saw it visually, but just the maps on like NOI by district, where it went up and where it went down, and then the other map, which is rent by community district. I was just very, every time I look at visually where you're seeing dips and increases in rents or in distressed buildings, it just always correlates to where we've seen recent rezonings or large development or changing in the community that like makeup itself. And to me, and maybe this is what I read off of what I'm seeing, but what I see is, distressed buildings go up in areas that are being rezoned or areas that are, looking a little hotter than they were previous years for people to move there with higher income. And that tends to be a lot whiter also. And so I just find it interesting of where you are seeing NOI dip is also where you're seeing the most amount of development in my perspective. And so I know that the staff doesn't necessarily look at rezonings and things like that as part of this, but it's just something interesting that looking at it visually, it like stood out to me. And I think that's why that's why I find the actual map versions for me visually really appealing, because when I heard, and maybe Brian, if you can share I know maybe this is asking too much because you're a pro at this, but the notes that you read off of, because some of the things you highlight are the things that I tend to have questions about, because I'm looking at it and then you highlight something and I'm like, I don't see that. How do you see that? But maybe if I can read through them, I can vocalize what those questions are better.
You mean the notes for this presentation?
Yeah.
I mean, I think everything I say is in the bullet points, but do you want me to bring up one now or send it to you?
You can just send it to me.
Okay.
I can look through it again. But I think that for me, that's very, and obviously because of the line of work that I do, I often see, right, you're thinking about your Christian's question, you mentioned Chinatown. Chinatown is an area where in the organizing work that I know happens in the Lower East Side specifically, often people are organizing buildings with one rent stabilized building. And when you described what distress was, you're talking about financial distress, but the physical distress we also see in those buildings is a mechanism of the changing times of the area itself. And rezonings and people being pushed out are impacted by all those things.
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say that specifically with the maps, I do go through certain community districts, but actually all that discussion is in the text of the report itself. So I'll send you the slides with the notes. Yeah.
I have a question. On page 10, on the operating costs. In this operating cost, the percentage does not include the real estate taxes, right?
It does.
It does.
Operating cost ratios include real estate taxes.
Include the real estate taxes. Okay,
Mhm.
so it's already accounted for. Okay,
Right.
just wanted to make sure. Okay.
So maybe I can ask another question. So is the assessment by the staff that overall NOI we're not seeing anything in NOI or changes in NOI this year that are raising any red flags about the actual viability of the housing stock that's rent stabilized right now?
Personally, it seems, NOI going up is a good sign. So I wouldn't, looking at that, I'm not concerned about it. Each board member can obviously look at the data they want. And, if you look at distressed properties, that went up a tenth of a percentage point, which isn't good, but NOI is overall good, I think.
I just want to point out this is for calendar year 2019, and we've always used this data set to set guidelines. I understand that. I think that we don't have any pandemic data on the impact. So I just caution that this year, that, and we hope to have some speakers who can address what's happening now, because this data is from 2019. So, but it's the data we always use. With that said, but it is a bit of a different year. So I just wanted to comment that. So yes, it reflects 2019, you know, but not 2020.
Right. So right. So as Brian is saying, the NOI is actually good. The NOI is looking so good. Yeah. Normally we base our decisions on the previous year data. In this case, we were never hit with pandemic. So it's kind of like decide how, you know, all these, or how this is affecting our decision for 2021, right? So I think we will need to see more information about what are the drivers, you know, what's driving our decision. We need to see more numbers, it's kind of hard, you know, because the information that we're getting is not current. And I know that you provided us with a lot of surveys that reflects, you know, what's happening in the country. And to use those surveys to make your decisions and to look at data, but we're actually looking at data from 2018 and 19. So it's kind of like a little hard, right? So I don't know if I'm making a sense.
No,
Alex?
I think you are, and I don't want to make any assumptions about what will be 2020. We hopefully get some people to speak on that, or we do, but you know, I don't want to make predictions of what NOI, income, you know, expense and rent will be for next year.
Sorry, can
one of
I
the
jump on that point? I think that my question is really, I think I'm going to be really clear that I feel like often we've had conversations about not having huge, having what some folks might say moderate or small increases in rent based on what we think is going to happen. And so now that we see the data of 2 consecutive years where we were constantly having conversation about, you know, the sky might fall, you know, rent stabilized stock would be hugely impacted if we had a 0. And now we see that like the impact was there, but it was the intentional impact that we wanted to have, which was to slow down, from my perspective, specifically what NOI growth was throughout the years. And to be very direct, I don't want us to fall back into what we did last year, which was say, we don't know what the impact of COVID is going to be. It might be over by the summer. They're saying the weather is going to make it better. And then we saw the most marginalized people hardest hit, not just by the pandemic health-wise, but also in their jobs and in their livelihoods. And I want us not to consistently, like, until we have the data, we consistently make decisions on what rental impact will have on tenants without having the data for that year, because we think landlords might not do as well. I don't want to make that mistake this year. If we have data that shows something next year, that board will have to grapple with the decision of what they make based on the data they're seeing, not what they think the impact will be as we go through this year. And so I just want to put that out there, because this year specifically, folks that I'm coming into contact with and the work that I do are, you know, barely able to feed themselves, have been out of job for over a year. And so if we're thinking about like how to mimic some kind of simulate a fair market rate or a fair market in New York City, I think we have to take that into account in a year like this is going to be critical, not to make a decision of what we think of how hard landlords might be hurt in future data if we don't have that data now, because my experience just sitting on this board has been that every time we anticipate huge dips in NOI because of the decision we're making, we don't see those huge dips the way that for me personally, I would like to see, because I know that a lot of folks are struggling in the city just to make ends meet. And looking at boroughs like the Bronx, where, you know, a lot of folks that I'm coming in contact are paying 50% or more of their income in rent, in a community where I work, where people are making $27,000 a year and lost their job in the middle of a pandemic, while also having to take care of their kids, all of those things that people with limited income will struggle with. And so I just want to make sure that the framing that we're coming from is actually looking at the data that's available to us. And, you know, anecdotal data would be great, but I want to make it clear that I personally think that that's like a mistake, because, you know, predicting what we think will happen without having data of what's actually happening is a mistake. And I think that our data bears that when we look at the year we're in and what's happening the previous years, we've made the best decisions possible. And I think that, you know, just the chart that Andrew brought up on page 7 sort of shows that, like, we've had the impact we wanted. We might not know the full impact of the rent laws right now, but I think we're seeing it in the numbers, that we haven't seen a huge dip in NOI, even with rent laws changing and some rent freezes in previous years, and historically low increases over the last 7 years.
I see Alex has his hand up.
Yeah, actually following very much on what Shayla was just saying. So I understand that this data, the RPIE data, covers 2019. So half of that year was under the previous regime, where landlords could take increased rents with vacancy allowances and with the previous MCI, apartment improvement increases. And then the second half of that year, they were not able to take those additional increases for vacancies and the same amount for major capital improvements and apartment improvements. So is that correct? So half the year there was the status quo prior, and then half the year was under the new era of post the rent reform rules. Is that correct?
Yes.
Correct. Yep.
And so it is striking that with half the year, with landlords being restricted in what kinds of increases they could charge, we still see an increase overall in NOI.
And I don't know if this would impact the data that we're looking at, but Ryan and Andrew, I don't know if you guys are looking at because you can still apply for an MCI 2 years after the work was completed. So we might still see residual increases on that basis alone, even while the rent laws are in place. So I think that's just something to keep in mind, because we might still see, you know, think about 2 year span, like you could have finished work in May of last year and applied for a MCI rent increase, and you might not truly see what all of those impacts are until a couple of years later, because the retroactive fee, retroactive MCIs. I don't know if that impacts anything, Brian, but
well, the MCI, I mean, you can file going back 2 years, but the increase in the MCI is based on the new law, so the per month increase would be lower. They don't follow the older law regarding how much the MCI goes up.
Along those lines, but maybe operating in the other direction, and also to Alex's point, when we think about the increase in NOI in 2019, the law was in effect for half the year, but only that would only affect, I think, 25% of leases, because half of roughly half the leases are 2 year leases, and then half the leases that are 1 year leases were renewed in the first half. So the impact in 2019 will be smaller than it will be in future years. So it's a transition year. And that's, I think Shayla is saying, well, there's some transition things that will see higher amounts, but I think there's also some transition things that will see lower amounts as well.
And of course, next year, I mean, it's going to be impossible to know what the rent law's impact is versus the pandemic. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I saw that Leah had made a motion for a comment and Christina had made a motion for a comment. So Leah, did I catch that right, or?
You did. I wonder though, we are about the income and affordability study today, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll wait to make my comment for that.
Yeah, I just had a quick question to sort of follow up on Cecilia's clarification. For the NOI does not include real estate taxes, but then on the chart on page 7, that's talking about gross cost to income. So when you're talking cost, that includes real estate taxes. I just want to be clear.
No, all the costs we report include taxes.
All costs. So but then when you're talking about NOI, that also then does include real estate taxes?
Yeah, it's always included, yes.
Well, but Christina, it's included implicitly because NOI is what remains after you've paid your expenses, which includes your real estate taxes.
Okay, that's what I wanted to make sure. Yeah, but it does not include any like debt that you might have on like any debt costs.
That's right.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, and okay, so that helps me understand some things. Thank you.
Brian, could you bring up the slide from the memo, not from, I think it was your last or second to last slide, because I wanted to get back to a point, a good point, I think that Shayla made, but it ties into something that Andrew was talking about when he was talking about kind of when NOI ratios can, be a yellow flag or a red flag about building performance.
Sure. You want
I'm not sure it's NOI ratios. I think it's cost to income ratios you're referring to.
Yes, that's right. Andrew, you're totally right.
I'm sorry. Which slide do you want?
It was from the memo.
Memo, yes. Cost income ratios. You said, or the yeah, let me bring that
Pull
up.
up cost to income ratios. I was thinking about like the 80% or more rent stabilized in outer boroughs. I think that, Andrew, am I getting that right?
I believe so. I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and then, but it's not this slide. It's maybe this slide. So I, to Shayla's point, but maybe tending in the other direction about where we might see concerns. So cost to income ratio. So the overall, the citywide seems like healthy, 62.2. I'm looking in the upper right-hand corner for citywide, 80% stabilized. When you slice and dice it a little bit, it comes out a little bit lower. Or where am I? Core city without core Manhattan, 62.5. And then down at the bottom when you're looking at the unaudited cost to income ratio. So the right number, according to Andrew, is somewhere between the audited and the unaudited. But city without core Manhattan at 68%, that's probably inflated, so it's less than 68%. But I think that's something that the board should focus on. That it's, if the right answer is somewhere for the outer boroughs or for city without core Manhattan is somewhere between 62.5 and 68.1, that's just something to pay attention to. I don't think that's super healthy. If you look at the historical averages, I don't think it's terrible, but it's just a kind of a number to keep our eye on, I think. That was my only comment on that.
I have another question, actually. I mean, it's Andrew, can you bring up again the chart on page 10, the cost to income and cost of rent? Okay. So my question about this is that you were talking about the trends. I mean, it's like this is more on the theme of, what to look out for. I mean, it's like red or yellow flags to look out for. And you were talking about the trend that we should look out for a leveling out of these ratios. But I'm actually looking at the gap between them. So I'm assuming that the gap, is showing sort of rent to income in this case. It's like and canceling out O&M. And I can see that in a year like 2011, there was actually a much bigger gap, about a 10 percentage point gap. While in other years it was narrower. It's like in many years it's actually about a 5% gap, and right now it's somewhere in the middle. It's about 7 or 8%. Is there something that we should be looking out for there?
Well, the gap would change depending on what's happening with commercial rents.
Sure.
So I think that would explain the difference in the gap between when you're talking about rent and O&M to rent versus O&M to income. You know, it probably just tells you the health of the commercial unit. So as the gap closes, it probably has more to do with what's going on, you know, with commercial rents than with residential rents, because they tend to keep growing in the stabilized stock anyway. But this includes free market units. So there's other things going on there. Rent could be down because the influence of the rental market, you know, in say 2009 and 2010, where you start to see the income O&M to income ratio come down. You know, that it could be the impact of a recession on the free market units. So it's hard to say what the gap means, but there's a gap between the two. But there's different factors that would impact that gap.
Okay.
So for example, if a loss of commercial rent is a big issue this time around because of pandemic, you know, the O&M to income ratio should go up because you have less income. If costs remain, even if costs remain the same, you know, that ratio should go up on the income side. Not so sure about on the rent side. So, you know, but maybe, you know, without the true data set, we'll have to see.
Okay, so basically what I hear you saying is that the gap, I mean, is really reflective of commercial income.
Commercial income and just rent that's impacted by the free market.
Got it. Okay.
I mean, residential rents during this whole time period consistently, you know, stabilized rents were going up.
But Andrew, just to clarify that, the O&M to rent, that would include market rate units.
Yeah.
No? All right. So the gap is not. Oh, so
what I'm saying is what impacts these two things most likely are commercial rent on the income side.
Okay.
And, you know, rent, I think has consistently gone up in the stabilized units. Where it fluctuates is in the market. So from year to year, that income can be impacted by what's going on in the market.
Would it be possible to sort of see this chart, but just for stabilized?
We don't have the data just. I mean, all these buildings have stabilized units.
Mm-hmm.
So
so the universe is just all buildings that have stabilized units.
Yeah, right. Now, what we could do, knowing that if we eliminate core Manhattan, we could do these charts without core Manhattan.
Sure.
And that, you know, we know that 82% of the remaining buildings have 80% or more stabilized units in them. We could reproduce this chart, you doing that.
Actually, yeah, I think that's the better thing that I was.
That would get a truer picture of the stabilized building.
That's right. Yeah.
Christian, what's your hypothesis? Like, what do you think it might tell us?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, it's like I was just asking you really about this. I mean, it's I knew that the commercial. I knew that part of the answer was, I mean, it's like that it reflects you know, the portion of income that comes from services. And I also imagine that there are some buildings that have more access to income from services than others. And so there's that issue as well. Yeah, I mean, it's like, but I was wondering if there was anything else that you knew that, you know, might be interesting about that gap in particular, just because I noticed that it had fluctuated. And yeah.
Other questions on the income and expense report?
Brian, can you direct me? I saw in your presentation, and I'm trying to find the numbers now, but you had some visual that had the income with, wait, I don't know if we have this actually. Maybe I'm asking the question we were asking earlier, but the income with the commercial, I just remember seeing like the boroughs where the rent is lower, they had a higher other kinds of income. That's like what I read from it, but I don't remember what the chart was. I'm trying to find it now. Let me see if I can.
I
Not
think
sure.
the share that comes from commercial and services was higher.
Yeah. Where was I'm like trying to find it. It's fine. I'll eventually find it.
You mean the share by borough? You talking about the percentage that of commercial rent, commercial income by borough?
Yes.
There's not, actually, that was in the text. I don't think it was a chart. That's on page 5. I could do a screenshot of that if you want me to bring it up.
But I think we had it as one of the slides though, Brian.
Yeah, but it wasn't a graph. Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, it's yeah, I guess I brought up the text in the report. It's 10.8% citywide, 15.6% in Manhattan, 10.6% in the Bronx, 6.9% on Staten Island, 6.3% in Brooklyn, 5.8% in Queens.
What page is that on?
That's on page 5 in the report.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was in the slide 7.
Thank you. Slide 7.
Same numbers, but
I just had an observation about it because I found that shocking to see the areas where you are able to collect the least amount of rent. You have income coming from other services like commercial services being higher, and I just found that interesting. I wonder if that's something to look at in a year like the pandemic year where I would assume, people pay their rent, and then any other services that they tacked on might have been something that like they scaled back on or something. And I wonder if that's going to have impact on the data we see next year.
this is probably the proportions. They vary slightly from year to year. I mean, it's a function like in the Bronx having the second highest percentage by borough is just probably because the buildings tend to have maybe more, I would guess, more retail than, let's say, buildings in Queens, just by the nature of the type of building.
Other questions in the on the income and expense report? All right. We hadn't talked about this before, but should we do a short break?
Yeah, I'd like to start.
Okay. Andrew, what do you think? 10 minutes? Is that appropriate, or?
It's up to you. It's 11:12 now.
Why don't we say till 11:20, an 8-minute break? Is that sufficient?
Zoom in at 11:20.
All right. And then we'll come back in at 11:20 and we'll hear from Danielle on the income and affordability report. Is that right? And then that's our last report for the day.
Correct.
Great. All right. We'll see you all in 8 minutes.
Just make sure everyone mute yourself. I'll put
Yes.
this up while we're on break because we're still going to be streaming.
Okay, thanks.
All right, it's it's 11:20. So once people put on their cameras, we'll know we're back in session.
David, I'll keep the screenshot on until you get ready, until you're ready to start. Is that right?
Yeah, there's about whatever 4 of us still with
Okay.
cameras off. So I just want to make sure people have gotten back
Okay.
to their computers.
We do have 26 people who can listen on or watching on YouTube, so they can.
Okay.
They'll hear. They'll see the screen, but they'll hear as we're
Okay.
talking.
Well, welcome to all of our viewers. This is more viewers than we usually get when we have this at 1 Center Street. So
You know,
that's great.
hanging on while during the pause.
I think I know that one person may be having internet connectivity issues. Do we think we can start? Is that okay? Andrew, are you there?
You may not be here.
Okay, let's give Andrew a second. Yeah, Cecilia and Alex, if you're there, just let us know. Even if you end up having your camera off, if you can.
Leah is trying to get back on.
Okay.
And we have one attendee, Tenants and Neighbors, has been on with us since the beginning.
So
Through Zoom.
Through Zoom, so not through the YouTube viewership.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell if they're on YouTube as well, but I know the one attendee we have on is registered as Tenants and Neighbors.
All right. So I'm not sure that Celia and Alex are back, but Alex, Andrew, what do you think we should just start? It's a little bit after when we agreed to come back.
Yeah, it's fine by me if it, if we.
Okay. All right, let's
Everybody else is good.
let's get started. Danielle, the floor is yours for the Income and Affordability Study for 2021.
Thank you, and almost good afternoon. Give me 1 second to share my screen. Just confirming, you can only see the PowerPoint slide, right?
Correct.
Okay. The Income and Affordability Study is researched and presented each year in accordance with, I'm sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty because I wasn't expecting the videos to be on the side like this. And now I can't see my,
At the top of the videos, if you hit the smallest line, it should reduce us to one little dot.
yes, thank you. The Income and Affordability Study is researched and presented each year in accordance with Section 26-510B of the Rent Stabilization Law, which requires the Rent Guidelines Board to consider relevant data from the current and projected cost of living indices and permits consideration of other measures of housing affordability in its deliberations. To assist the board in meeting this obligation, RGB research staff produce an annual Income and Affordability Study, which reports on housing affordability and tenant income in New York City's rental market. This study highlights year-to-year changes in many of the major economic factors affecting New York City's tenant population and takes into consideration a broad range of market forces, rent levels, and public policies affecting housing affordability. Such factors include New York City's overall economic condition, including unemployment rates and inflation rates, as well as household income and housing costs, and other relevant factors such as the number of eviction proceedings and homelessness levels. In summary, 2020 saw New York City with a contraction in gross city product, which in inflation adjusted or real terms decreased by 6.3% during calendar year 2020, the first decrease in 12 years. The city also lost an average of 516,600 jobs, an 11.1% decrease and the first decrease in 11 years. And inflation rose at the same rate as the previous year, with prices rising 1.7% on average during 2020 in the metro area. Inflation-adjusted wages increased by 6.0% in real terms over the prior 12 months, but real total wages fell by 1.8%. The unemployment rate rose to 12.3%, up 8.4 percentage points. In housing court, non-payment cases fell 56.4% in 2020, and calendared cases fell by 62.7%. Evictions also fell by 82.0% during 2020. Homeless staying in city shelters decreased, falling by 5.9%, while the number of cash assistance recipients increased by 8.6%. And the number of food stamp recipients, now known as SNAP, increased by 5.2%. As this graph illustrates, 2020 saw rising unemployment rates for both New York City and the nation as a whole. The New York City rate is in yellow and was 12.3% in 2020, the highest unemployment rate in New York City in at least the last 45 years we have records for. The US jobless rate is in blue and was 8.1% in 2020. As this graph illustrates, initial unemployment claims in the first weeks of the pandemic rose exponentially, rising by the greatest proportion in the week ending April 11th, 2020, when initial claims in New York City rose by 3,516%, from 5,103 in the same week of the prior year to 184,525. As time goes on, the number of initial claims slowly drops, with claims in the last 3 weeks of the chart, 1 year after the pandemic started, 70% lower than the previous year. This table compares the number of initial unemployment claims in the first year of the pandemic to the same period of the preceding year. For the first full year of the pandemic, the total number of initial claims is up 647%, or 2,133,298 claims in New York City as compared to the same period in the prior year. Claims in Manhattan rose by the least amount, 515%, and claims in Queens rose by the most, 803%. The increase in claims in New York City is higher than both New York State and the US as a whole. While claims rose 647% over the whole year, as the graph on the previous page illustrated, claims generally decreased over time. For instance, comparing the week before shutdowns began in 2020, the week ending March 7th, to the same week of 2021, initial claims in New York City increased 218%. This table compares the number of initial unemployment claims in the 3 weeks ending March 13th, March 20th, and March 27th, 2021 to the same weeks of the previous year, which were the first 3 weeks of the pandemic shutdowns. As the table shows, claims are down 70% in New York City, the same rate as New York State, but less than the US as a whole. Claims decreased by the greatest proportion in Manhattan, down 74%, and by the least in the Bronx, down 60%. As this graph shows, New York City lost an average of 516,600 jobs in 2020, an 11.1 decrease, and the first decrease in 11 years. As this graph shows, both nominal and inflation-adjusted wages rose in the most recent 12-month period, which runs from the fourth quarter of 2019 through the third quarter of 2020. Real wages are shown in $2020 and increased 6.0%, while nominal wages increased 7.9%. Note that the average wage is the amount of total wages paid in New York City divided by the total employment in New York City. Therefore, average wages can increase even as employment and total wages decrease. This was the case in New York City during the past year, when employment levels and total wages dropped in both the second and third quarters of 2020, even as average wages increased. This graph shows the change in inflation-adjusted total wages in the second and third quarters of 2020 as compared to the same quarters in 2019. Total wages are the amount of wages paid to all employees during each quarter. During the second and third quarters of 2020, while total wages in New York City did increase in 4 industries, finance and insurance, information, government, and the combined industries of agriculture, mining, and unclassified, they fell in all others. The greatest proportional decreases were in the accommodation and food services and arts, entertainment, and recreation, which saw total wages decrease in real terms by 62.8% and 40.9% respectively. Average employment in these 2 industries fell by 59.3% and 52.3% respectively. For all industries, total wages fell by a real 7.9% and average employment fell by 16.5% during these 2 quarters. This graph illustrates monthly unemployment compensation received by 3 hypothetical single earner households since the start of the pandemic. A household with 1 minimum wage worker, previously making $31,200 per year, a 1 income household, previously making the median rent stabilized household income in 2019, $49,000 per year, and a single earner higher income household, previously making $80,000 per year. The graph illustrates the monthly New York State unemployment insurance or pandemic unemployment assistance payments that would be received by each of these sample households over time. As the graph illustrates, both the minimum wage household and the rent stabilized household would receive half of their pre-unemployment income from New York State unemployment insurance in March of 2020, while the higher income household receives 1/3 of their former income and only slightly more than the rent stabilized sample household. Because of $600 per week pandemic unemployment compensation payments, in April of 2020, both the minimum wage household and the rent stabilized household would receive more than they were previously making working full-time, while the higher income household is still at a loss. Between August and December of 2020, without extra pandemic unemployment compensation, all households are making less than they did previously, while from January through August of 2021, with $300 per week pandemic unemployment compensation, the minimum wage household earns exactly their previous wage, while both the rent stabilized household and the higher income household are at a loss. Note that the graph specifically illustrates unemployment income for single earner households. There are countless variables that affect the total compensation for households with more than 1 wage earner, with the most significant variable being per person pandemic unemployment compensation payments, which added an extra $2,600 per month to compensation from April through July of 2020, and will add an extra $1,300 from January through August of 2021. These payments are per person, so a single unemployed person previously making $80,000 per year, for instance, will receive less monthly household income than would 2 unemployed persons in a single household previously making $40,000 each. This graph illustrates the poverty rate for New York City individuals and New York City renter-occupied family households. As the yellow bars on the graph show, the poverty rate for individuals in New York City in 2019 fell for the 5th consecutive year, and as of 2019 was 16.0%, compared to 12.3% for the United States as a whole, which is not shown on this graph. The graph also shows the poverty rate for renter-occupied family households, shown in blue. This rate dropped for the 7th consecutive year and was 17.8% in 2019, compared to 3.9% for owner-occupied households, also not shown on this graph. A source of rent and income information is the annual American Community Survey conducted by the Census Bureau. The most recent data from this survey is from 2019. Unlike the HVS, which is able to be stratified for rent-stabilized tenants, the ACS provides data for all renters in New York City, regardless of regulation status. Looking at median gross rent to income ratios from this survey from 2006 through 2019, the rates have ranged from a low of 29.9% in 2007 to a high of 32.7% in 2014. The ratio was 30.1% in 2019, a 1.3 percentage point decline from the prior year. The American Community Survey also reports on the proportion of households who are considered rent burdened and severely rent burdened. That is, households paying at least 30% or 50% of their income towards gross rent, respectively. The totality of each column represents the number of households paying at least 30% of their income towards gross rent. Looking at these ratios from 2006 through 2019, the proportion of households paying at least 30% of their income towards rent has ranged from a low of 50.1% in both 2008 and 2019 to a high of 55.1% in 2014. As noted, the ratio was 50.1% in 2019, a 2.5 percentage point decline from the prior year. Looking at monthly contract and gross rent from 2006 through 2019 in real 2019 dollars shows that from 2006 to 2019, rent has increased in inflation-adjusted terms by approximately $300 a month for both contract and gross rent. In 2019, the latest available data, median contract rent was $1,385, an inflation-adjusted increase of 1.9%, and median gross rent was $1,483, an inflation-adjusted increase of 1.1%. This graph illustrates the average annual change in household income between 2006 and 2019 by quintile. Each quintile represents 20% of households, with the lowest quintile representing the average income of the bottom 20% of earners, and the highest quintile representing the average income of the top 20% of earners. While not necessarily true in each individual year, over the entire time period, income grew more quickly for the top earners than the bottom earners. In real terms, household income rose by an average of 0.4% each year for the lowest quintile and rose by an average of 1.8% annually for the highest quintile. The American Community Survey also reports on renter housing costs as a percentage of income for different income brackets. As the household income increases, so does housing affordability. In 2019, 88.0% of households making less than $20,000 a year had a rent-to-income ratio in excess of 30%, but at the upper limit, those households making at least $75,000 a year, the ratio who spend at least 30% of income on rent drops to 12.0%. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. Census Bureau launched a new survey initiative, the Household Pulse Survey. Per the Census Bureau, the online survey studies how the coronavirus pandemic is impacting households across the country from a social and economic perspective. The first survey week, week 1, was conducted at the end of April, with data collected on a weekly basis through July of 2020 and then every 2 weeks since. Despite going to a 2-week collection period, the survey continues to call these collection periods weeks to maintain continuity. The Household Pulse Survey defines housing insecurity for renters as the percentage of adults who are both not current on rent and who have slight or no confidence that their household can pay rent in the next month on time. For renters in the New York metro area, shown here in red, this proportion ranged from a low of 10.7% in week 17 in October to a high of 23.8% in week 12 in July. Those with higher incomes in 2019, shown here in yellow, were consistently less housing insecure than those with lower incomes. Sorry, mixed up my colors. The lower income households are in yellow, and the higher income households who are making over $100,000 in 2019 were less housing insecure. During week 12 in July, 38.0% of renters in the New York metro area with incomes less than $35,000 in 2019 were considered housing insecure, 30.9 percentage points higher than those with incomes of $100,000 or more, also equaling the differential in week 3 in May. The smallest differential between the two income groups was in week 15 in September, a difference of 10.6 percentage points. The Household Pulse Survey also questions respondents on food scarcity, defined as the percentage of adults in households where there was either sometimes or often not enough to eat in the last 7 days. For renters, the proportion of households in the New York metro area who reported having experienced food scarcity within the past week ranged from a low of 11.8% in week 16 in September to a high of 28.4% in week 12 in July. As with housing insecurity, there was a significant difference in food scarcity among those at different income levels. During week 12 in July, 45.6% of renters with incomes less than $35,000 in 2019 were experiencing food scarcity, 44.4 percentage points higher than those with incomes of $100,000 or more. The smallest differential was 18.6 percentage points during week 1 in April of 2020. The Consumer Price Index, which measures overall inflation in both the United States as a whole, as well as metropolitan areas, can be disaggregated to see the rate of change in rent. Note that the CPI is not exclusive to New York City, as the study area extends into the suburbs of New York City. As the graph shows, the percentage change in rent for the New York City metro area in yellow has increased at a slower rate than the US as a whole in blue for the past 7 years. In 2020, rents in the metro area rose 2.0% and rose by 3.1% in the US. We now move on to cash assistance recipients. The yellow portion of the graph shows the number of recipients in the Family Assistance Program, and the darker blue shows the number of recipients in the Safety Net Assistance Program. The light blue bars represent the number of recipients who have transferred from the Family Assistance Program to the Safety Net Assistance Program. In 2020, total cash assistance cases rose by 8.6%. This chart shows homelessness levels for all individuals during calendar years 1990 through 2020. As you can see, levels decreased 5.9% during 2020, the second consecutive year of decrease. In the preliminary fiscal 2021 Mayor's Management Report, the Department of Homeless Services attributes some of the decline in homelessness to increased rental assistance and the eviction moratorium. Moving on to housing court, as this chart shows, over time, the proportion of filings that are calendared, that is the proportion of non-payment cases that actually make it before a judge, which is in blue, has generally been increasing over time, while the proportion of those cases that actually result in an eviction or possession in yellow has been much more steady. In 2020, the proportion of filings that are calendared decreased 7.9 percentage points, and the proportion of calendared cases that resulted in an eviction fell by 11.0 percentage points. As mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, in 2020, non-payment cases fell by 56.4%, calendared cases fell by 62.7%, and evictions fell by 82.0%. These decreases are all occurring concurrently with an eviction moratorium in place since March 20th, 2020. The recently enacted New York State fiscal year 2022 budget allocates $2.4 billion towards the COVID-19 Emergency Rental Assistance Program of 2021. Using a combination of $2.3 billion in federal funding and $100 million in state funding, the program is aimed towards helping New Yorkers pay rent and utility arrears. Per the program's guidelines, applicants are required to meet certain standards to qualify, including a household income at or below 80% of the area median, unemployment, a reduction in income, significant costs, or other financial hardship that are directly or indirectly due to the COVID-19 outbreak, and demonstrating a risk of homelessness or housing instability. Note that income can be calculated based on either total income for 2020 or the household's current monthly income at the time of application. The program provides for up to 12 months of rent or utility arrears. It also permits up to 3 months of additional assistance to be paid if it is deemed that extra resources are required to ensure housing stability and funds remain available. Assistance will generally be paid directly to the landlord and/or utility, but if they are found to be uncooperative or unresponsive, as determined by the statute, and do not accept the funds within 12 months, they will have waived their rights to both the program's funding and the same amount in arrears from the tenant. Acceptance of payments for rent arrears constitutes agreement by the recipient landlord to waive any late fees on rent arrears, keep rent constant for 1 year, and in most circumstances, not seek to evict tenants for 1 year after the first payment is received. This table summarizes some of the key indicators we have discussed during this presentation, with the change in each quarter and annually as compared to the same time period in 2019. A more detailed version of this table can be found in Appendix 12 of the report. In summary, for 2020, the city's economy contracted for the first time in 12 years, contracting by an inflation-adjusted 6.3%. And there was a decrease in employment levels, down 11.1%, or a loss of 516,600 jobs. The unemployment rate rose to 12.3% citywide during 2020, an increase of 8.4 percentage points, and the highest level since at least 1976. Average real wages increased during the most recent 12-month period by 6.0%, but total wages fell by an inflation-adjusted 1.8%. There were increases in the number of cash assistance cases, which rose 8.6%, and SNAP cases, which rose 5.2%. With an eviction moratorium in place since March 20th, 2020, there was a decrease in non-payment court filings of 56.4%, while calendared cases fell 62.7%, and evictions fell 82.0%. And homeless levels, also impacted by the eviction moratorium, fell for the second consecutive year, down 5.9%. Note that many of the negative indicators during 2020 showed improvement when comparing the fourth quarter of 2020 to the third quarter of 2020, including positive trends in the unemployment rate, employment, cash assistance, and SNAP caseloads, and gross city product. Thank you, and I will take any questions.
So people should feel free to jump in, and if a lot of people are trying to get in, maybe we'll do raising hands. Alex, you get it on both counts.
So anyway, thank you very much. This was really, really helpful. One question, which it's not in the report, but I'm just curious if there's any information on the total aggregate arrears in New York City. So we see that the state has authorized $2.4 billion in rental assistance. I'm just curious if anyone knows to what degree that will cover the backlog of rent that people have not paid.
I have not seen any definite numbers on that. I think it would be quite complicated to get an exact number on that because it would have to be reported. And as far as I know, that hasn't had to be reported yet. There might be some estimates out there, some approximations, and I can try to look for that, but there's not going to be an exact number.
Right.
I will say that.
Oh, go ahead.
Go for it, Leah.
The Wall Street Journal ran a story that said that there is approximately $1 billion in rent owed just in New York City alone. And you know, I just wanted to briefly say that yes, we heard information earlier about the fact that there's less homelessness or less evictions, but obviously we know that there's been an eviction moratorium. And we also know that though there has been an eviction moratorium, the moratorium still means that folks will owe rent when the moratorium is over. So we know that the work that we're doing here directly impacts New Yorkers. And I also briefly wanted to say that though there has been some form of rent relief programs, what I'm seeing on the ground as a tenant attorney is that a lot of folks have had a lot of issues and problems applying for the rent relief programs, and haven't had a lot of success. So I wanted to make sure that was a factor as well.
If I could just interrupt, we do discuss that in the report. There's a discussion of the previous programs for rent arrears that were being managed by HCR, and that there wasn't that much money distributed and it was very difficult to apply. The new program that's going into place is going to be through a different agency. It's going to be through OTDA in Albany, and the exact application isn't worked out yet because it only just got announced, but it will be through a different agency. The qualifications are less stringent, and hopefully more of that money will get distributed, and it will be retroactive. So if you started owing rent in April, it will be retroactive to April. So there is a discussion in the report. I just want to make sure people know that.
This is not as much of a question, but as acknowledgement of, for me, as being part of a lot of, and I think Leah, it's probably true, a lot of the organizing that happened in order for that the rent relief bill to get passed. I just want to thank all the folks who actually were collecting all this data in the midst of a pandemic in order to be advocating in Albany. And I think that the program is deeper than previous programs, to Danielle's point earlier. It also does include excluded workers, which have been historically excluded from a lot of the relief that we've seen in the city and throughout the country. And so I just want to recognize that, Albany reacted to what was happening and listened to what was happening on the ground. And I think that this program, it isn't the be all, because if I remember correctly, and I'm trying to get the actual numbers from folks who were in the fight. But if I remember correctly, the number that they're using for the rent relief program was an old number that we had gotten collected throughout the summer. And so the number of actual people who would qualify, who might need the relief, is a lot more than what we've budgeted as a state. Julia's comment earlier, and we know that the need in New York City is likely going to be really high, but the devastation of COVID on low wage workers, and even when you look at the data that Danielle went through on workers who are making $80,000 or $100,000, is extremely impactful. And COVID-19 is not only lower their income, but now that all the debt that people have accumulated. I'm gonna also prefix all of that by saying that we've gotten a lot of there are certain landlords that we are following, specifically in the Bronx, that are taking people to small claims court to collect back rent because they know they can't go through housing court to do it. And so we've seen that pop up in specific landlords who are using it as a mechanism to displace people with the fear of having this huge judgment against them in the future that wouldn't be captured by the housing court data. And so something for us to keep our minds open as we go through this process and continue to see data in the upcoming years and months. Danielle, I don't know if you mentioned this in the report. I can't remember if I saw it, but that the moratorium does end on May 1st. And so
the federal moratorium is through, I forgot now, it's in the report, June 30th, maybe.
I think so.
So New York State has the option to come in with a stronger moratorium than the federal moratorium. But if they do not, then the federal moratorium stays in place. So there is a moratorium. I think it's June 30th, but there is a discussion about that in the report.
Yeah, and I just want to flag that even though we know that there was a moratorium nationwide, I don't know if folks watched the news during COVID, but many people, many families throughout the country were getting evicted. And so even in a moratorium like in New York City, we did get a lot of tenants, especially folks who were undocumented, constantly calling us saying, I'm moving because I'm terrified of what this might mean for me without understanding their rights. And so I think there's a lot of moving pieces of like what the impact of COVID is, but also that we haven't yet felt what that might look like in the upcoming months and years when we see the impact, long-term impact, if people do get judgment in civil court to pay rent that they couldn't pay while they were in their apartments working normally because they couldn't make ends meet. Imagine what would happen if that any amount of that debt moves forward because they don't get covered by the rent relief program, or the rent relief program runs out of money, or they're don't know that the program exists. There's no outreach that I know of that the city is actually, the state is said, we're going to mail everyone who could apply for this program or anything, any information. So it's going to be on the basis of, do people know the program exists and how do they tap into it? And I know that landlords can also initiate the process. And so also that opens up I think the feasibility that landlords can encourage tenants to apply by supporting them in that process as well.
Christian.
Yeah, quick question. So you presented data from the household pulse survey about housing instability. What are some previous sources of housing instability that we might that may have been used in the past? I mean, it's like, is there some kind of consistent source of data on?
I'm not aware of any. I haven't seen those kind of questions asked before. I'm not sure. You know, the housing and vacancy survey, which was supposed to have been conducted in 2020 and it's now been delayed a year. I'm not sure if they might incorporate some stuff into that regarding this for future. Because of the pandemic, they may have added some questions about these kind of things, but I'm not aware of anything in the past that dealt with that. I can certainly try to look, but I don't think so.
Yeah. One possibility might be the Community Service Society, if I remember correctly, has a
yes, there is.
Yeah.
Community Service Society, which if you look through a lot of the past reports, they do have a survey. I'm a little unclear if they do it every year and they just don't publish every result every year or exactly how it works. But in many of our past reports, that's a good point. It's a much smaller sample, of course. But they do ask people not exactly those questions, but they'll say, you know, are you behind on your utility payments? Are you behind on your rent? And it's not the exact same question, but it is something similar. And you can find the full reports on Community Service Society's website or in some of our past reports. But they don't present, at least publicly, they don't present the exact same data from every single report every single year. I think they have it. They just don't publish it publicly. So, but thank you, Alex. It's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm asking the questions is because I'm curious to see how housing instability has changed throughout the pandemic, taking into account the rental assistance, the moratorium. I mean, it's like all of those benefits that are available now compared to before. I'm curious as to some way of measuring that in a consistent way.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing is, I don't know how long they're going to continue to do the household pulse survey, but as we get further and further out in the pandemic, you should start to see things normalizing to how they were pre-pandemic. So if they keep this going, even though it's post-pandemic, the further out you get from the start of the pandemic, theoretically, things are stabilizing a little. I got an email while we were in this meeting from the Department of Labor that the seasonally adjusted New York City unemployment rate went down 1.2 percentage points in March, which is a pretty big drop. So, things are starting to come back. And if they keep that up, then I think that'll be a good judge of maybe how things were before. If that makes sense.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you.
The floor is open.
I think we have to do a breaking news scroll at the bottom of our screen.
Actually, I do have one more thing that I'm curious about. So are there any sources of data on who's taking the rental assistance? I mean, whether it's tenants, landlords. I mean, it's like I'm asking this because there was a Wall Street Journal article that said that landlords are not taking the assistance because of the stipulations that have been put on it. Not
Right.
not for a year, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any updated information on that we can look at?
The new program is different than the programs that were in place before. And this is detailed in the report. I can put back up the slide if you want. But one of the stipulations in this new program is that if the landlord does not take the money, there's very specific part of the statute, like if we try to contact them 4 times and they don't respond, or, I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but it's very specific the way you have to try to contact the landlord about taking this money. And if they don't respond, or they say, I'm not going to take it, they have 12 months to basically change their mind. And if they don't change their mind in 12 months, they both can't get the money ever that was offered to them, and they can't sue the tenant for that money. So it's just gone if they don't take it. So they really don't have much of a choice. It's use it or lose it. So the new program is very different, and there's a lot more money available. The original program had $100 million available. This is $2.4 billion. So it's going to be a very different ball game, and we have to wait and see what's going to happen. But HCR did not put out that much. There is a report on their website from October, from the first round of the original program, and they hadn't distributed all the funds yet, so the report is not complete. But basically, they just tell you how many people in each county were able to get the money, and that's really the only data that they gave.
All right, thanks for that.
Just to come back to the numbers on the rent relief. So in January was when the housing movement folks came up with a $2.2 billion of rental assistance was needed in January to cover what we had projected was needed from March to that point in January. And so our assumption is that that number has continued to increase throughout the last few months. So even if the program works the way we hope it intends to work, and landlords either use it or lose it, like that will impact tenants in a really concrete way. And so I don't know if that means that there'll be more money available for folks later on, but my understanding is that they're opening the application process for a short period of time and then moving on to like actually distributing the funds. So I wonder what impact that will have, if any, if the deadline, if the previous program, the tenants had, I think, the 2-week period, they extended it to 3 weeks to apply. The applications are not easy, and people may not necessarily know the programs exist. So I wonder how this program will work, and how long, what is the period of time that people will be able to apply as far as tenants in order to be able to get the.
I tried to look at the bill to find that information, because there was an original bill that got superseded, and that bill said 6 months for applications. And my original write-up about that bill had the 6 months in it. So when I went to change the write-up for the new bill, it might be in there and I didn't see it, but I don't see it. But most of the components, most of the components of that original bill made it to the final bill. So that might be an indication, but I'm not sure because it's not in there.
Yeah. And shout out to Met Council, our only folks watching, or were the ones who ended up texting me about the numbers and when they got the data. So
Any other questions or for Danielle or comments about the income and affordability report?
I don't know if everyone can hear me clearly. My internet is kind of spotty right now, so I don't know if I'm being spotty.
You're pretty okay.
Can folks
Yeah, we
hear
can
me?
hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, all right. Well, the one comment that I wanted to say is I think that we as a board need to just be cautious because for the last few years, what I've noticed is if there's any type of redress for tenants, like for example, the new rent laws that were passed, and now the rent relief bill, that's often characterized as some sort of superfluous like win to give tenants an edge over landlords, when in fact these are relief packages in order to make things whole, or at least to balance what's already what we know to be an imbalanced market. This is one of the most unaffordable cities in the world. So I think I wanted to just emphasize that and say that it's important that we, well, everyone's frozen now. I'm wondering if folks can hear.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Well, okay. I wanted to just emphasize that, and we should be cautious about that because, for last year, to be quite, conversations for me were quite triggering because, some of the narratives were equating people in a harsh and unprecedented year to profits. And if it's triggering for me as a board member, it's probably going to be triggering for folks watching as well. So I think there's often, and I don't want us to make the mistake to sort of equate what are types of redress or relief to fix what's broken, which is really not the same as some type of unfair that would put tenants over landlords. So I and I'll just end by saying, the reason why some of these conversations for me are triggering is that, if you've been in New York City for a long time, you know how unaffordable it is. And if you've been on the train, you don't need to read reports. You can see the homelessness crisis. And so there's been a crisis from before the pandemic, right? There's been a whole crisis from before the pandemic. There's been a crisis that disproportionately impacts tenants of color. And we can see that in the homelessness crisis. And Danielle mentioned the CSS reports. Those reports also show the correlation between race and evictions as well. And that anytime that is mentioned, what I have also noticed on this board is that is pigeoned as political, and it's not political to note anything that's not white. So if you make a statement and say the majority of tenants of color, or the majority of tenants who are being evicted are tenants of color, that's not a political statement. That's us using statistics. And so I just wanted to also flag that as well, because it just means that when we're having conversations that affect New Yorkers, and we're talking about anyone who's not white, then sometimes that narrative is deemed a conversation, which means that we're talking about things in a way that is normalizing us being colorblind, when in fact we need to be race conscious about who these decisions are affecting, especially during this time. So I wanted to say that because it dawned on me that if I'm feeling this way and I'm on the board, and obviously I'm the tenant representative and represent tenants, then it's very likely that a lot of folks who are watching this might also feel the same way as well. And it might equally be triggering for them as well, that, before the pandemic, and it just seems to some extent that the lack of empathy or the normalization of that kind of like pain, economic pain, has been going on for a very long time. And now that we this different type of pandemic, you know, there are all of these conversations like, oh my God, we need to do something. And so that all of that might be triggering for folks watching. So I felt the need to say that. I'm done speaking.
Thanks, Leah.
Any other comments or questions? Okay. All right. So I think that is all of our business, Andrew. Am I correct about that? You're on mute, Andrew.
In terms of the reports, yes, but there were a few board issues that I want to just, well, actually, it's the schedule that I wanted to go over. I hadn't posted the remainder of the meetings because I just wanted to confirm that those dates work for everyone. So I'd like to put up our draft of our remaining meetings and see if the dates work. And if not, let's see if we can settle them now so we can post the rest of our schedules. So yesterday I had sent around the last one that we had sent around in the end of March. And so I'm going to put that up on the screen and we can have a discussion about if anyone has any conflicts with those.
And Andrew, how will we do it with our as of yet not named new member? We may need to, I mean, even if we all agree, there may be some possibility we'll have to revisit if they can't come to an important meeting, right?
It's how you want to handle that.
Okay.
We need you need a quorum.
Okay.
To hold.
All right, so I'm just going to say.
Then you need 5 votes to pass anything.
Yeah.
So with that said, you can proceed however you want to proceed, but.
Yeah, I'm going to say that I will try, if there's a conflict for our new member, that we will try to address that. That will be something that I will try to do.
Hopefully the dates work for whatever new member.
Yeah.
So these meetings have been posted. So our next meeting is April 22nd. We have then one on April 29th, which is when tenants and owners that are invited by the tenant members and the owner members on the group come and present before the board. Our preliminary vote is scheduled for May 5th. So those dates are all set. So the remaining 4 dates is I just want to confirm with everyone. So May 27th, we have another meeting of the board where there's staff report presentations. So that is May 27th. Our hearings are now scheduled for June 15th and June 17th, and then our final vote is scheduled for June 24th. So if anyone has any issues with any of these dates, please let us discuss.
So Andrew, I do have a conflict with that final vote on the 24th. I will be traveling that
Okay.
day. So I can do Wednesday. I mean, it's really just the 24th and 25th that are the problem.
So then does Wednesday, June 23rd work for everyone?
It works for me.
Works for me.
Yeah.
Works for me.
Yes.
All good.
I'm good too.
So the proposal is to move it to the 23rd, correct?
Right. So Wednesday, the 23rd will be our final vote. Not a problem. Okay. The dates of the hearings, the 15th and the 17th. And then, so May 27th, did anyone have an issue with that particular?
Yes, I do actually. That's a conflict for me. I can do the following week on Tuesday, if that works for everyone. Let's see. Oh no, sorry, that was a Thursday, the 27th. Yeah, I can do the following Thursday if that works for everyone. Just June 3rd.
So you're away. Is that the situation?
Yeah, I'm away from the 20th of May to the 31st.
First.
If it's any consolation, I'm away now as well. And I'm going to meet it.
Okay.
Oh, so we have two conflicts with the May 27th date. Okay.
No, I don't think, Andrew, I don't think that's what Scott was saying.
Oh, what did he say? I'm sorry.
He's away, right? He's away today.
I was just pointing out our forum allows people to log in.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying.
Yeah, it's where I'm going to be is I'm not likely to have internet, so I'm going
okay.
to be in the jungle. So
I mean, the reports are such that the data won't be really available, will be much before the 27th on one of the reports. So we wanted to have it initially. I think the date we had thrown out there was May 20th, so we had moved that to the 27th. So really trying to do it before the 20th would be somewhat problematic for us. I mean, the report wouldn't have completed data that we normally have, but that I guess we could subsequent later. So the question is, do we want to have it like on a Tuesday, May 19th, or do you want to have it, beginning of June? That's fine with me. Either way works for us. So
if it'll be less of a time crunch for you, I mean, how about the beginning of June?
I mean, we don't have to meet on a Thursday either, so we could meet. Let's see. So I assume Memorial Day is the 31st. It is. So we could do June 1st. We could June. Maybe we want to do June 2nd or June 3rd, somewhere in there. Does that work for folks?
Why don't we just stick to the Thursdays, just because that's our consistent date, and just do the 3rd, unless people have a problem with it?
June 3rd?
Yeah, 2nd and 3rd both work for me.
June 3rd may work for me, but I have another meeting going on at 12 o'clock. So,
Okay.
yeah, I can be, a few minutes, or I can leave a few minutes early if that's fine with you guys.
All right. So
Or we may end by then.
Yeah, we may be over by then, but what we'll do then, I will send a revised draft with these two new dates. I'll give everyone 24 hours or through the weekend, and then I can make them public on Monday. How about that? Does that make sense?
Someone is just flagging that I think we might be trying to pick a day for primary day. And like, when are the primaries?
June 3rd is the primary? I don't.
Aren't primaries on
Usually a
Tuesday?
voting day is Tuesday, right? Or does that not always the case? Let's Google that.
June 22nd, it looks like.
Sorry, I was just thinking about the final vote, if we're moving it, for us to keep that in mind, not to pick that day, maybe.
Yeah, the mayoral is June 22nd, I think.
And we said the 23rd. Is that what we said?
Yes.
That seems okay.
So are we proposing June 2nd or June 3rd for the
June 3rd, I think, is what we had. David's thought was to keep it on a Thursday, just
sure,
because people who are familiar with our schedule know that we meet Thursday mornings. So
okay, all right, June 3rd.
Okay, so again, what I'll do is I'll put these two changes on the draft. I'll send that around, and I'll give you guys the weekend to come up with some reason why you can't make the new dates. No, just kidding. Just give you a little time to check your calendars, and then we'll make them public early next week.
Okay. Anything else, Andrew?
That's what I had.
Okay.
Sorry,
great.
I don't know, David, if we were gonna have discussions on like the public testimony hearings and
certainly can.
expectations around them.
We certainly can.
I'm just I spoke to David, and I don't know if Leah wants to chime in on some of this, but about the public hearings, specifically when we're inviting folks to give testimony from the public. And last year, I know that we were in a little bit of a crunch trying to figure out everything while COVID was you know, I don't know if I should say kicking into gear, but getting worse. And I think we reacted in the best way possible, I think within the constraints that we had as a board. I think this year we should do better. The calendar that we're even considering and having a conversation on is still keeping 2 hearings. Whereas in previous years, when we've been normal, we've had 4 hearings at different, you know, during the nighttime. And so I just wanted to put out there that I think that we should, one, have the hearings last as long as until the last person testify, the way we do on a normal year. And also make sure that we are keeping registration open and not restricted the way we did last year, which I think restricted a lot of the testimonies we heard. I just want to make sure that like I didn't leave it, I did not say that, and then we had expectations about what those hearings were going to be without all being on the same page.
I think just to react first to the first point, I think last year we kind of amongst ourselves all agreed that we would, you know, not that every single person could stay till all hours, but I think pretty much everyone agreed that we would stay because we just had the 2 days. And so I'm kind of operating under the assumption that people would make that same commitment for this year. You know, of course, if people have familial responsibilities that might keep them from doing that, I think we all understand that. Andrew, is there a technology question about signups that we just need to be, you know, I think we all want to have signups be as open as possible, but are there any technology limitations that we need to be aware of?
We've taken a look at it. Our intent, and there's not going to be a restriction on how tenants or owners or how many or public officials, as many, that's fine. We could do that and not limit the number of people signing up. We just have to figure out signing up and make sure, because it would be an online process again. It would be similar to last year. We're working through the, you know, exactly how that would work. But we wouldn't, you know, we could certainly make it open-ended registration for tenants to, I mean, for people to come up and sign up and speak. It may include like certain blocks of people signing up. We would just continue to add blocks of people. We would just continue. So we may initially have where there's, you know, 100 spots or whatever, but then we may have to just keep adding more slots, which is fine. As we see, as those fill up, we'll just add more and more. It's working through the technical issues of that. We also want to, you know, we're hoping to assign people numbers so they know when they're speaking. And we have to work through the technical part of that as well. But our intent is to totally, you know, respect that and in past years, just keep the registration open to everyone who would like to speak. So
can I say just
we
one?
can make that happen. It's just a question of how it will look.
Can I say just one thing, 2 things? Yeah, there was that issue last year where the spots got filled up very quickly, but we almost immediately opened it back up to what we called a wait list, but everybody who registered to speak, they were contacted and said, you are able to speak. We are going to do things differently this year so that we don't have to have that wait list, which was a little confusing. But I'll just say from what would make things easiest is, and this is just a general thing for any sort of organizer for tenants or for owners, if you are going to register on behalf of other people, if we can have their email address, if they're going to testify by phone, if we have their phone number, you need to ask them, are you going to go on video or by phone? If it's by phone, we have to have their phone number. If it's going to be by video, it would help us a lot if we had their actual email, so that when we do send out these reminders, or if we don't have an exact number for you when you sign up to register, that I can then email and say, okay, you're number 27, so that they know that. And that, I think, would help a lot of the confusion. So I'm just putting that out there generally for people who organize. If you are going to register people on their behalf instead of them doing it themselves, those things would make it, I think, easier going ahead, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think that brings my next point on the restrictions that people have on with technology, even if they have small children in schools, like the devices might be in use in other spaces. But I do think that if we can have the form, I think it's fine to ask people if they have an email, but if we can have an either or, because a lot of the folks we were registering, I personally registered, and my staff was registering, were people who don't have access to the internet or can't get on. And so we were using our email because they don't have emails. But
No, there was the option to register by telephone, but the form said you have to give us your telephone number, because then when we go into Zoom to let people in, we need to match up the telephone number they provided to the phone number they're actually calling from. So it's not, they don't have to give us an email address, but it has to all kind of match up. And if they do have an email address, even if they want to testify via phone, it just gives us a way to contact them and say, okay, here are the instructions, here's your number, because we might not have an exact number to start with. We're trying to work out those kinks. But yeah, people are free to register on the telephone. That's completely fine.
Thank you. I'll continue to finish my point, but I wanted to say that like a lot of the members that we're in contact with might have a house phone that gets cut off, and then we use their cell phones. And so that transient of like numbers is something that we constantly deal with as people who are supporting the folks who are the most marginalized in the city. And so emails and phone numbers then become a issue with folks who are a little bit, especially in the middle of a pandemic. I could tell you how many people I've called in 6 different numbers just in a span of 6 months, because they're staying in different places, they're using someone else's phone. And so I know that it would make it easier for us, but I don't want to make them required pieces. And then like if someone were to come into the Zoom and say, hey, I'm this person, and their numbers doesn't match, like, is our position that we're excluding them from testifying if none of their information matches? I don't think that that's what we're saying. So making it a requirement from the beginning, like making it a required field to have either or might be difficult for some folks.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I wasn't suggesting that exactly. I was just, last year, there were some groups that registered people and there was no individual email addresses listed. And I'm just saying, if it's possible, if there is an email address, to give that email address, it just allows us a way to contact people directly. And that's all I'm saying. But yeah, certainly I understand all those issues, and it was not a requirement last year. It won't be a requirement this year. It just helps us, if we have the email address, to contact people, because even though we did this last year, it's still all kind of new for us. And we're learning as we go. So we just want to make sure that we're informing people as much as possible on our end. We just want to keep people in the loop.
I also think there's just an overlay that all of us just need to be concerned about, that we all experience, which is just Zoom bombing. And so the way that we can, better confirm people as the registered speaker just reduces the likelihood of people coming in and disrupting our meeting who are not signed up to speak.
Could there be a way of sort of updating email addresses or telephone numbers in real time? So, so that if on the day of, somebody says, oh, hey, I'm actually going to call from this number. It's like, could that be done in real time? Could there be some staff support around that? Is that a possible thing to be done?
Maybe. Possible. Somebody would have to email us, and it's that communication with people so that they have our email address. Like, they can't call us during the meeting, or even that day, like it's too hectic. But if they emailed us, yeah, possibly that would work. But again, that's why this, as much communication as we can have directly with people so that they know their options, I think that's just a positive thing, really. It's not always going to be possible. People don't have email addresses. And yeah, you have an issue with your phone, you have an issue with your internet, all that stuff. We did last year, even with the Zoom bombing, we let people speak at the end who wanted to speak. So even if your phone number didn't match, yeah, you might not get called as early as you might have if we were able to match up your information. But at the end, I assume, again, there will be that option to say, okay, anybody who didn't speak yet, who wants to speak, just raise your hand in Zoom, and then we will call on them.
I just also wanted to I know that we seem like we're all on the same page, and I have spoken to David, and it seems like all of these things will happen, but that interpretation will be provided for folks who come and testify at the public hearings in Spanish for sure, and that if organizers or people who are working with folks directly impacted who want to testify have a specific language that is needed, if they can let the board or folks on someone on this board let them know that you need that language, so that we can see if there's a mass of people who need the language to provide an interpretation in that language as well. And I'll highlight, we've had Mandarin in the past between a very specific time frame when we know those folks are testifying. I'm assuming we'll make those accommodations as we move through this process to make sure that we're accessible for folks who not only speak English and Spanish but other languages as well. And that's a commitment that David said that it seems that we have, but I just wanted to on record say that that's something that we're going to keep doing. And that if anyone does run into any issues registering themselves or other people to testify in the system, whatever structure the staff is able to create to make that happen, to flag it for both staff and other folks, so that we can make sure that we're being as accessible and the technology is working as it should be.
Agreed. And Andrew, I think we talked already about translation, and we don't expect that to, as long as we have notice, we don't expect that to pose any problems, right?
No, I mean, I think last year, obviously we had it for Spanish, and I think it ended up working out because we were able to work. If there's something there that we were missing, Shayla, look, I know we can discuss. Why don't we talk if you have concerns, because you've been doing this at CASA as well. So if you have tricks of the trade that I certainly want to hear them. But no, we would be opening it up for Mandarin. We've done that in the past. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to include everyone who wants to come. And I think in the end, we'll find out, we'll be able to do something that, we can involve people as much as we can. So yeah.
And I'm just saying that so that it's on for folks to know that the coalition that often supports and helps inform Leah's and I's deliberation on how we advocate and the data we use, or even the speakers we bring up to speak, are that coalition, the Rent Justice Coalition, was actually demanding for us to make sure that our hearings, we had more than hearings than we did before it last year, similar to what we were doing when we were in person, to have 4 hearings. I think that just with our scheduling conflicts just right now, I think it's a good example of how difficult it is to get us all on the same to agree on a date for a hearing. But I also want to make sure it's understood that the compromise is to make sure that we accommodate as many people as we can in those days. And so if you run into any hiccups, to please communicate that to me so that I can best advocate and make sure that the process with the board is happening as we hope to intend to, which is be as inclusive as possible, make sure we provide interpretation in languages that are needed, as well as making sure that people have the ability to participate in this process, specifically if they want to give their testimony, and make sure that it's open for until the last person testifies. So that's something I will work on. But if you do hear or see something else on your end as people who are doing this work directly, please let me know.
Yep, you got it.
Sounds good. Any other new business from board members? Okay. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
They say so motion. Is that the language?
Sure, it's good enough, but I need
I don't know.
I
I
need
don't
a
know what the
second.
Robert rules language is.
Second.
Second. All right, we are